Welcome, everyone, to the Read Talk podcast. The podcast designed to bring information, read-making tips, and lightheartedness to your read-making desk. Each podcast features a leading oboist in our field and does a deep dive into a question on every oboist's mind. How do I become a successful readmaker? Joining us today to share her read-making secrets is Nancy Ambrose King, professor of oboe at the University of Michigan and international recitalist and recording artist. I'm Margaret Marco.
And I'm Courtney Miller.
Let's talk reeds. Welcome, Nancy Ambrose King. We are so thrilled that you could join us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We're going to start with what we call here on Read Talk, the nuts and bolts. I know our listeners would really love to hear about your basic setup, like what gouge do you use? What shaper tip do you recommend? What's your tying length? What measurements do you use? All that stuff.
So currently I'm using a Cooney Bear gouging machine, which I really love. I have a 10.8 blade in it, although I have another machine with an 11 millimeter blade as well. I also have two RDGs that are terrific and an Inalady. And my shaper tip, I'm going back and forth usually between the Caleb -1 and a Mac Plus or a Mac Plus. I have gone to and from the Caleb -1 for probably 30 years now, and I always seem to find my way back to it. So I would say it's probably my shaper tip of choice. Although in the winters here in Michigan, it gets pretty cold at times, so sometimes I'll experiment with a little bit wider shaper tip in the middle of January and February just to get a little more vibration in the reed.
Do you also change your diameter then in the winter?
No, I use 10 to 10.5 pretty regularly, in fact, always. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I've even experimented with 9.5 to 10 in a really brutal winter, but usually I find if it's measuring about 10, 10.25, I'm happy with the reeds even in the middle of the winter.
And just to explain to our listeners why you would change diameter based on the weather.
Well, if it gets very cold, then the heat in the buildings is cranked up very high and the buildings get very, very dry. And when we have a dry climate inside, then the reeds are quite closed, so a smaller diameter tube will just give a little more opening to the reed.
Right. Oh, great. So how about staples?
Staples. I've been using the Chudnow Silver S staple, which is the solid staple, and I've also been using that for probably 30 years. There's a similar staple called the Chirugi 2 Plus that has the same dimensions, but it is a cork staple. So if students prefer cork to the solid silver, then that's a good option as well.
And is there any benefit of using the solid tube over the cork?
Well, I think it's a personal preference. I find that with the silver, or I also have gold, I just prefer the silver, I find the reeds last a little longer. I also find that they project a little more, so I'm able to scrape the reed down and make it a little bit more flexible depending on some of the pieces I might be playing on a long recital. I might want a reed that is very flexible and easy for me to play on, but yet I really want that projection as well. And I find that I do get that with the Chudnow staples.
Oh, that's so interesting. One thing, before we leave this topic, if you could talk to us about your measurements, your gouge measurements and your scrape measurements, I think that'd be so helpful for our listeners.
Sure. My gouge is set up to be about 60 in the middle and about 48, 49 on the sides. I generally tie on about 73, 73 and a half, depending on the shape. And I almost always have a 70 millimeter finished reed. And I'm very religious about a 4 millimeter tip and a 5 millimeter heart.
Great. Yeah. And it's so important, I think, to build in consistency into your reed making. So I think just having those measurements is going to improve your reed making immensely if you stick to them every time.
Can you describe characteristics you're looking for in a dream reed?
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm sure we don't encountered dream reads too often, but I think the most important thing is that we aim for response and intonation first in our read making. Typically, if the read is responsive and it is in tune, the tone quality that we're looking for will be there as well because the read will be balanced. I think students can often get in trouble by trying to make the tone quality their number one goal in the read before it is even responding or before it's crowing properly. And they find themselves getting into trouble then because they may take off too much in the heart, going for a really dark sound. And if they do that, then they might have a wobbly read or they might have trouble in the high register. So I think, going for the response and the intonation is really crucial.
Why do you think students, and I think oboe players in general, we do fall into this habit of seeking a quote-unquote dark sound and putting that perhaps above the more important attributes you just described, such as response and stability?
I think that it's true that everyone is looking for, we use the word dark as being positive and bright as being negative. However, I think in Europe they use bright as the positive. So I think it's very subjective, and I do feel like everyone has a tone quality that is unique to them, and that's what makes the oboe great. I mean, it's such a vocal instrument. It is so much like the human voice. So, I think that it's tempting for students to play on really hard reads at first, thinking that it's giving them this really deep covered sound that they're looking for. And that's very often misleading because then they have a read that they really can't control or manipulate, and then they don't get the colors that they're looking for. So I think really what our main goal should be, instead of using the words dark and bright, we should be looking for color in the read. And some of our colors should be shimmery and pastel, and some of our colors should be deep and dark and covered. But we really hope to have the whole palette in our tonal scheme.
That makes a great transition into the next section of our podcast, where we focus on the more philosophical aspects of reed making. We all know there's more to reed making than just tools and measurements. What is your philosophy regarding maintaining a reed case full of working reeds?
Yeah, it is very important to have a full reed case at all times. I think personally that reed case should have reeds in all stages in it, though. So I make my reeds over a few days, and my reed case will have blanks in it. It will have reeds that just have, I call them day 2 reeds, but they just basically have the outline of the reed set in. I'll have reeds that are just good for practicing. I'm ready to play them and sort of work with them and getting them flexible and maneuvering with them, but they're not ready for performance yet. And then I have finished reeds. And I think for our mental health, it's a good thing to have our case represent reeds in all those stages so that we're always working on reeds, that are at different levels of their finishing. I would also say some great advice that was given to me when I was a student is to resist the temptation to move on to the next step of that reed making process before you've completed the first. So in other words, until that reed measures properly, don't crow it, because it's not going to crow correctly if there's still bark on it. Right. And then don't put it in the oboe. And this is the hard thing to resist sometimes, but don't put it in the oboe if it's not crowing the crow that you like, octave C's for most all of us. And because you can make a reed, you can manipulate it to do all kinds of stuff. And so if it's not crowing right, it's not finished and it's not balanced. And you certainly don't want to get up and play a 2-hour recital on a reed that's not finished. So resist that temptation to go on to the next step. It confuses you.
Oh, right. Oh my gosh, that's fantastic advice.
So on this kind of theme of patience and planning, I want to talk a little bit about what you do for reads for recording sessions, because you have so many wonderful recordings out there, CDs and on YouTube. You record so much and make it look so easy. So I'm very curious about how you approach reads for those sessions.
Yeah, well, recording, as you know, those are very long sessions, and you're pretty much constantly playing, sometimes the same thing over and over and over again. So we need a lot of reads to make a recording, but they all really have to be very similar to each other, because you can't risk that anyone can possibly hear that you did change reads. So I try very hard to only play on one read for a given piece of music that I'm recording. So if that's a through composed piece that's 12 minutes long, like the Kaliwota or something like that, one read, even if it's going to take a couple hours to record that piece, one read. But I might switch back and forth between reads for different movements. But generally, yeah, you need a lot of reads that sound the same.
That makes a lot of sense. How far in advance do you start? I don't want to say hoarding, but maybe stockpiling, preparing for reads like this, depending on the season, I guess.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm always making reads in advance. I mean, typically when we're getting ready for a big performance or a recital or a recording session, months before and even weeks before, we're practicing 80% of the time, and read making is not as important. As we get to the, a week before and definitely a few days before, that ratio completely flip-flops. And then it's 80% making reads and looking for those reads that are going to, work for you. And, hopefully by that point you have the music down anyway, and you can use the hours of the day for read making instead of the nuts and bolts of going over those passages again and again and again. So yeah, I think I try and have my reads set a couple days before, or at least have an idea of which ones are promising. But of course, we're always touching them up in the hour, before we're going to play. So the hours before and the days before.
I want to go back just a little bit to something you said about your day 2 read. And if you could elaborate on that, I think it would be very interesting for our listeners. And maybe you could even start with describing how you take a read from a blank to a finished read.
Sure. Well, I've heard that the cane itself, before it really settles completely, it needs to go through about 3 different drying and soaking times, because, we're really manipulating the cane, and, we're squeezing it, and we're making it form around an oval when it may not want to form around that tight of an oval. So by making a reed over a few days, we're allowing the reed to go through those soaking and drying processes. Mm-hmm. And I find that then once the reed is finished, it's less likely to change. And I think they last a long time. They last longer when you take a long time to make them. So the first day I would, gouging is separate. I would have done that before. But the first day I would shape and tie on and set in the slope a little, take off the bark so that the reed is sort of from the side. The profile looks like the letter A, it's pointy at the top. Mm-hmm. And then I let it sit. And the next day is really the most important, because I start my tip at 66. So I put in the tip. I make sure that the back is scraped up to 61, and I put in basically the outline of the reed, and then I'll clip it open and I let it dry again. And the third day, I get it out and I finish the tip. I really get it vibrating. I get it to the point where it's crowing well. It's still a little bit unwieldy at that point, but I feel like it needs to be played on. So given the choice between scraping the reed in, if you need to play it right away, you just have to, or breaking the reed in by practicing on it for 30, 40 minutes, I would definitely want to practice on it and let the cane become flexible from the vibrations and your air flowing through it instead of more knife time. So I'll practice on the reed at the end of that third day. And then the fourth day is just touch up and hopefully